It was a hot summer evening in San Diego, and it was a particularly sweltering one. The patrons at the Blue Whale were asking for ice in their drinks, and the ceiling fans were barely keeping up with the heat Travis Murfield was wiping down the counter where he'd been bartending for 3 years. He loved this place, a small bar 2 blocks from the ocean, with live music on the weekends and regular performances by local artists. In half an hour, a new dance band was about to start. He had no idea this night would change his life. Desiree Clark was the last to appear on the stage. She stood out among the other dancers at once, not only by her technique, but also by some special energy. Her graceful movements, fiery red hair, and emerald eyes attracted attention. In every gesture you could feel professional training, but there was something more in her dance, a story she told with her body. After the performance, she sat down at the bar, ordering only mineral water. This also distinguished her from other dancers, who usually preferred cocktails. Travis was fascinated by her restraint and that special melancholy that seemed to envelop the girl in an invisible veil. "Lovely performance," he said, serving ice water with lime. She looked up, and Travis felt something tingle in his soul. There was a whole universe in that gaze: fatigue, dreams, disappointments, and hopes. Their romance was developing rapidly. That night, they talked until the bar closed. Desiree told him that she had been dancing since she was 16, traveling all over the country with different groups. She'd performed in Chicago and New York, toured small towns in the Midwest, but everywhere she'd felt like a stranger. Now she dreamed of a real home and family, something she never had. Her parents had divorced when she was 5, and since then she'd lived with her mother and father, never staying anywhere for long. Travis, who grew up in a small town in Northern California, talked about her childhood in a large and close-knit family, how he helped his mother in the kitchen and dreamed of one day opening his own restaurant, about how he came to San Diego after college with a few $100s in his pocket and grandiose plans. His sincerity and ambition conquered Desiree. She saw him as a man who could turn dreams into reality. 6 months later, they were married. A modest ceremony was held on the coast, where only the closest people were present: Travis's parents, his sister and her husband, and Desiree's best friend from the dance troupe. The bride glowed in a simple white dress bought on sale, and Travis couldn't take his eyes off her. Instead of an expensive wedding trip, they spent a week in a cheap motel on the Big Sur coast. In the evenings, they walked the beach, made plans, and dreamed of a future that seemed so clear and promising. The first year of their marriage was filled with plans and hope. Travis worked double shifts, working at a bar during the day and a fast food restaurant in the evening, saving every dime he could. Desiree left the dance company and took a job teaching dance at a local studio. They rented a tiny apartment in a not-so-wealthy neighborhood, saving for everything. But they were happy. When they had enough money saved up, they bought a used van and converted it into a mobile diner. Travis had always loved to cook, and his signature burgers with a secret sauce, the recipe for which he spent months developing, quickly became popular with local office workers. Happy Burger, that's what they called their food truck, began to bring in a steady income. Travis would get up at 4 in the morning to prepare all the ingredients and secure the best spot in the business center parking lot. By 8 in the morning, the van had a line of regular customers lined up for his famous breakfast burritos with eggs and hot sauce. Desiree helped with the bookkeeping and sometimes substituted for her husband at the counter, but increasingly, she complained of fatigue and monotony. She began skipping classes at the dance studio, saying it no longer brought her the same joy. By the end of the 2nd year of her marriage, her smile began to appear less and less often. In the evenings, she would spend long hours on social media, looking at photos of her former dance company colleagues touring the country. In the pictures, they were always happy: bright costumes, applause, parties after performances, new cities. Desiree began to buy expensive cosmetics and fashionable clothes, which did not fit at all into their modest budget. She answered her husband's questions about spending sharply, saying that she did not want to turn into a dull housewife, that she needed to keep in shape and appearance. Travis did not notice how his wife was gradually changing. He was too busy developing the business, calculating expenses and income, negotiating with suppliers, dreaming of one day opening a real restaurant. In the evenings, counting the proceeds at the kitchen table, he imagined how he and Desiree would grow old together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, how they would sit on the veranda of their house and remember those difficult but happy days. But his wife had very different plans. On their third wedding anniversary, Desiree insisted on dinner at an expensive oceanfront restaurant. Wearing a new black dress from a famous designer, she seemed especially beautiful and somewhat aloof, like an actress on stage. Travis, who felt uncomfortable in the only suit he'd bought for the wedding, wrote off her pensive mood as fatigue, not realizing that this was the beginning of the end of their American dream. "Maybe we should think about having a baby," he suggested, raising a glass to their future. "Things are going well. We could afford a baby." Desiree wrinkled her nose and looked away, muttering something about bad timing and unfinished plans. She remained silent on the way home, staring out the car window at the lights of the city at night, as if mentally she was already somewhere far away. Perhaps in the cities where her former colleagues were still performing, or in the life she had begun to dream of. After 3 years of marriage, Desiree started going to the Olympus Fitness Club, one of the most expensive in their neighborhood. To Travis's objections about the cost of an annual membership, she replied that it was the only luxury she allowed herself. He'd agreed, hoping the exercise would lift her spirits. Olympus had an atmosphere of success and well-being. The marble lobby, the huge mirrors, and the latest exercise equipment all screamed of the luxury Desiree longed for. It was here that she met Caden Holt, a personal trainer whose looks were reminiscent of glossy magazine heroes. Caden taught group CrossFit classes. His athletic figure, polished movements, and especially the confident, slightly mocking look in his brown eyes had instantly caught Desiree's eye. After the third session, he offered her individual training, calling her a promising student. Their first meeting outside the club was at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Desiree lied to her husband, saying she was going to a dance school reunion. Caden proved to be an attentive listener. He asked with interest about her past in the dance company, about the dreams she had to leave behind for marriage. "A woman like you deserves better than a life next to a burger vendor," he said then, covering her hand with his. That simple gesture sent a shiver through Desiree's body that she hadn't felt in a long time. Their meetings became more frequent. Desiree made up new excuses to get away: fitness classes, meetings with friends. Travis, immersed in the problems with the food truck, did not notice the changes in his wife's behavior. And the problems were getting bigger. First, the refrigerator broke down, requiring expensive repairs. Then city officials raised the cost of licenses for mobile food outlets. Vendors raised the price of food, and the competition in the favorite parking lots was getting tougher and tougher. Travis was forced to take out a loan to keep the business afloat. Desiree, meanwhile, was spending more and more time with Caden. He showed her a different life, taking her to expensive restaurants and inviting her to private parties at elite clubs. She took money for new outfits from the family budget, making up stories about sales and random finds at stock centers. One night, lying in bed in an expensive hotel, Caden talked about the future. He talked about his plans to open a chain of fitness clubs, a house on the coast, traveling the world. "You could be a part of that," he whispered, kissing her shoulder. "But your marriage needs to be resolved first." That night, Desiree couldn't sleep. When she returned home, she stared at her sleeping husband for a long time, feeling for the first time not just indifference but real dislike. His snoring, his habit of scattering his socks, the perpetual odor of frying oil embedded in his skin, all these things disgusted her. A week later, she accidentally met an insurance agent, a friend of Caden's. He told her about a great life insurance program just right for small business owners. Desiree convinced her husband to take out a policy, arguing that he was concerned for his safety. Travis, touched by her concern, agreed, even though the monthly payments were onerous. $100,000 was the death benefit for the insured. Desiree often visualized this amount, planning how she would dispose of the money. She began to wonder about stories of perfect murders, reading articles about poisons that left no trace. Caden supported her plans, throwing in ideas and advice. In their small kitchen, where Travis made his signature burger sauce in the evenings, Desiree found herself looking more and more at the spice and seasoning kit. It would be so easy to hide something deadly among the dozens of jars. She knew that her husband never paid attention to the composition of his favorite seasonings. One morning, as she walked Travis to work, she kissed him for the first time with genuine tenderness. He was surprised by this change in her mood, but was glad, believing their marriage was finally on the mend. He didn't realize it was the tenderness of an executioner bidding farewell to his victim. The plan was ready. All that remained was to choose the right moment. The October morning was unusually cold for San Diego. Travis Murfield woke up at 4 a.m. as usual. Desiree slept curled up on her side of the bed. Lately, she had become especially thoughtful, cooking his favorite meals, taking an interest in things, even bringing lunch to the food truck a few times. These changes pleased Travis. It seemed their marriage was finally getting back on track. A thermos of hot coffee and a note wishing him a good day were waiting for him in the kitchen. Travis smiled as he tucked the note into the pocket of his work jacket. Such notes had been appearing more and more often lately. Desiree was becoming again the gentle girl he'd fallen in love with 3 years ago. The food truck was parked in the garage behind the house. Travis turned on the lights, habitually checked the food supply, pulled the convenience foods he'd prepared the night before out of the refrigerator. His signature burger sauce was in a separate container. Desiree had made a new batch herself, saying she wanted to help her husband with his chores. By 6 in the morning, the Happy Burger had taken its usual spot in the business center parking lot. Travis turned on the hood, warmed up the grill, and began preparing for the influx of customers. The first to show up were the office workers rushing to get breakfast before the workday began. By noon, the line didn't stop. His burgers were consistently popular. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he felt slightly dizzy. He put it down to fatigue and the heat from the grill. He drank some water, but it didn't get any better. By 3 o'clock, nausea and a strange numbness in his fingers had set in. Travis sat down in a folding chair, trying to cope with the pent-up weakness. "Hey boss, you okay?" A regular customer called out to him, noticing the pallor on the usually cheerful chef's face. Travis tried to answer, but for some reason his tongue wasn't working properly. His eyes were blurry, the sounds sounding like cotton candy. He dialed Desiree's number before he collapsed. The phone slipped from his weakened fingers. The last thing he heard was his wife's worried voice. "Honey, what's wrong?" Desiree arrived at the same time as the ambulance. She cried, holding her husband's hand as the paramedics tried to revive him. In the hospital emergency room, she was thrashing between doctors, demanding that everything possible be done. Her desperation seemed so genuine that no one could think to suspect her of being a murderer. Travis Murfield died without regaining consciousness. The preliminary report said it was a heart attack. Desiree sobbed on the chest of a rushed Caden, whom she introduced as a gym instructor and good family friend. The nurses shook their heads sympathetically as they looked at the young widow. The funeral took place 3 days later. Desiree, dressed in all black, held herself with dignity as she accepted condolences from her husband's few friends and clients. Caden loomed in the distance, posing as a grieving acquaintance. No one noticed as they exchanged quick glances over the fresh grave. That same evening, an insurance agent showed up at the Murfield house. Desiree, still in her mourning dress, signed the papers with a trembling hand. $100,000 was to be deposited in her account within a month after the formalities were completed. Everything was going according to plan. The poison added to the burger sauce was virtually undetectable in a normal autopsy. Desiree had scrutinized its properties. The symptoms mimicked a heart attack perfectly. She was sure she'd thought it through. But the next morning, the doorbell rang. Detective Prescott Ramirez from Homicide stood on the doorstep. "Mrs. Murfield? I have a few questions about your husband's death," he pronounced, watching her reaction carefully. "This is purely a formality, you understand. We're required to look into all cases of sudden death." Desiree invited the detective in, unaware that at this moment in the forensic lab, toxicologist Abigail Swanson had already discovered the first oddities in Travis Murfield's blood samples. The perfect murder was beginning to come apart at the seams. Detective Prescott Ramirez had been with the San Diego Police Department's Homicide Division for 20 years. Over the years, he'd learned to trust his intuition, which was now insistently signaling something was wrong with the food truck owner's death. Too many small details weren't adding up to the big picture. After a sleepless night spent studying the materials, he sat in his office again. Photos from the scene of the accident, medical reports, and witness statements were spread out on the desk. Of particular interest was an insurance claim filed just 3 weeks before Travis Murfield's death. The amount of the payout seemed disproportionate to the small business's income. Ramirez methodically went through each document, making notes in his notebook. He was alerted to the testimony of employees at neighboring offices where the food truck was usually parked. They all noted that Travis had never complained about his health. What's more, the week before his death, he had been discussing business expansion plans with regular customers. Anything unusual in toxicology? He asked Abigail Swanson over the phone. The experienced toxicologist had already been working with tissue samples from the deceased for a week. They'd met 15 years ago when Abigail had just started working in the lab and had helped each other with difficult cases many times since. "Come, Prescott. You need to see this." Abigail's voice held a tone of poorly concealed excitement. He knew that tone. She'd found something important. The forensic lab was sterile silence, broken only by the hum of instruments. Abigail, a tall woman with a short cut of graying hair, met the detective at the entrance. She wore an immaculately clean white coat, and her eyes read professional excitement. She led him to a microscope where a sample of liver tissue lay on a slide. "Look closely at these crystalline structures." She pointed to the barely visible formations. "At first, I mistook them for sample preparation artifacts, but something made me uneasy. I ran mass spectrometry and checked the rare toxin database." Abigail held out a printout of the analysis results to Ramirez. Her hands trembled slightly with excitement. "See these peaks? They're traces of a very rare plant poison. It's derived from the roots of a plant that grows only in Southeast Asia. It's worth a fortune on the black market. There have only been 3 reported cases of poisoning from this substance in the last 10 years, all in Thailand." "Action?" the detective asked briefly, studying the charts. "Mimics a heart attack, virtually indistinguishable, starts with dizziness, weakness, lack of coordination. Death occurs 4 to 6 hours after ingestion. Not detectable in a normal autopsy. If it weren't for a new analysis technique we've only recently implemented, we wouldn't have noticed it either." Ramirez tapped his pencil thoughtfully on the table, mentally going over the details of the case. "How could it have gotten into the system?" Abigail walked over to the computer and displayed the new data on the screen. Judging by the concentration in the tissues, the poison was ingested with food, probably shortly before death. "I've analyzed the stomach contents. There are traces there too." The detective recalled the witness statements. Travis was very picky about food and only ate what he prepared himself in his food truck. The only exception was the sauce his wife had made the day before. It was their family recipe, and Desiree insisted on making a new batch herself. The next day, Ramirez reappeared at the Murfield house. Desiree met him in a silk robe with impeccable makeup, an odd choice for a recently widowed woman. The house smelled of expensive perfume, and there was a half-empty bottle of expensive wine on the coffee table. "Mrs. Murfield, I need to ask you some additional questions," the detective began, watching her reaction carefully. "Tell me more about the last few days of your husband's life." Desiree spoke smoothly, without hesitation. Too smooth, Ramirez noted to himself. Her story sounded like a memorized text. She described how Travis complained of fatigue, how he was sometimes dizzy. But those details were contradicted by the witnesses. When it came to insurance, she tensed slightly, but quickly pulled herself together. "It was my idea," she explained, fixing her hair with a nervous gesture. "I was worried about Travis. He's been working so hard. The agent said it's common practice for small business owners." After the detective left, Ramirez parked a block away. His patience was rewarded an hour later when a late-model sports car pulled up to the house. Out of it stepped an athletic-looking man, Caden Holt, whom Ramirez had already identified as a fitness trainer from Club Olympus. The detective took out his phone and snapped a few pictures of Desiree greeting the guest with a passionate kiss right on the doorstep. Her behavior was strikingly different from the image of a grieving widow she had displayed during the interrogation. The murder theory was beginning to take shape. Over the next week, the police assembled an impressive dossier. Surveillance footage showed regular meetings between Desiree and Caden over the past 6 months, in restaurants, hotels, on the coast. Financial records revealed large cash withdrawals from Holt's account shortly before Travis's death, purchases from expensive stores, restaurant bills. Everything said the modest fitness trainer was living beyond his means. A waitress at an uptown restaurant, a small, cozy establishment overlooking the ocean, identified the couple from photos. "Yeah, they used to come here a lot. Always had a table in the far corner. Very close, if you know what I mean. I thought they were husband and wife. He left generous tips, though he dressed rather plainly." Abigail Swanson, meanwhile, continued her research. She found traces of poison in the leftover sauce taken from the food truck. And then she found the decisive clue, a tiny vial in a dumpster outside the health club. Lab analysis confirmed it contained the same poison. There were fingerprints on the glass. "You have motive, opportunity, and evidence," she told Ramirez, reviewing the lab results. "What are you waiting for?" The detective stared silently at the photos of the cooing couple spread out on his desk. Something was bothering him. Something wasn't adding up. Desiree seemed too inexperienced for such a cold-blooded murder. He felt he had to dig deeper. He requested Caden Holt's bank statements for the last year. What he found made him whistle. The fitness trainer was up to his eyeballs in debt. A mortgage on a luxury apartment, loans on expensive cars, unpaid credit card bills. And suddenly, big cash withdrawals that had started a few months before Travis died. "Where's the money coming from, buddy?" muttered the detective, looking through the documents under the light of a desk lamp. It was well past midnight, but sleep wouldn't come. The answer came unexpectedly. In the database of unsolved cases of district police found another suspicious heart incident 2 years ago. Rich housewife, insurance for a large sum, fitness trainer named Caden Holt among close acquaintances. Then the case was dismissed as a natural death. Ramirez leaned back in his chair, putting the mosaic together. The story was taking a whole new turn. Perhaps Desiree was not so much a murderer as another victim in a series of carefully planned crimes. Another piece in the game of a skilled manipulator. He pulled out his phone. "Abigail, sorry for the late call. I need your help. Run all the labs again. Look for any signs of contact with the poison on her skin or under her fingernails. I have a theory." That same evening, plainclothesmen showed up at the Olympus Fitness Club. They were closely watching Caden Holt, who was doing a group workout. No one noticed one of the exercisers taking samples from his gym bag left in the corner of the gym. 2 days later, Abigail called Ramirez. "You were right. Traces of poison on his stuff. And something else interesting in the hair samples. It looks like he worked with the substance more than once. This isn't his first murder, Prescott." The detective smiled as he looked at the picture of the cocky fitness trainer. The puzzle was finally coming together completely. Now it was a matter of piecing together the evidence and getting a confession. But one thing he was sure of: the serial killer had committed his latest crime. In Detective Ramirez's office hung a magnetic board filled with photos, documents, and notes. Red threads linked key elements of the case. In the center was a photo of Caden Holt. Surrounding it were his victims. Now Ramirez was certain Desiree Murfield was not the main villain in this story. The morning began with an emergency meeting attended by District Attorney Michael Stone. Everyone understood the gravity of the situation. 3 murders disguised as natural deaths could be the highest-profile case of the year. Abigail Swanson presented the results of the new tests. Holt's hair samples show evidence of systematic contact with poison over a period of at least 2 years. He worked with this substance on a regular basis. Moreover, we found traces of a similar substance in old cases, but at that time, the analysis technology did not allow us to identify it. Photos and data of the victims appeared on the large screen. Ramirez unfolded the documents. First murder: Eleanor Brighton, 45 years old, wealthy housewife, inherited her investor husband's fortune after his death. $500,000 worth of insurance, enrolled in Olympus to fight depression. Caden became her personal trainer, then her lover. 6 months later, death from a suspected heart attack. Next is Maria Rodriguez, 38, owner of a chain of beauty salons. Recent divorce, self-esteem issues. Holt shows up again, affair again, sudden death again, 300 grand in insurance. And finally, Travis Murfield. The scheme's changed. Holt's using his wife. But the MO is the same: manipulation, insurance, poison. A young officer entered the room with new information. "Detective, we've traced the financial flows. After each death, large sums of money were deposited into Holt's account through a complex offshore system. The money was routed through companies in the Cayman Islands, then Switzerland, and only then made its way to him in small installments." Ramirez began questioning Olympus employees. The receptionist recalled how Holt chose female clients. He was always interested in their marital status, finances. He only hired wealthy women with personal problems. The masseuse of the club told about a strange conversation. "Once I accidentally heard him talking on the phone about some rare herbs from Asia, mentioned Bangkok, some dollar amounts." Desiree sat in the interrogation room nervously rubbing the strap of her designer handbag. She had lost a noticeable amount of weight, shadows under her eyes. Ramirez started from afar, showing her photos of happy moments with her husband. "Tell me about Caden Holt. How did it all start?" At the mention of that name, Desiree flinched. After a long silence, she began to speak, quietly at first, then increasingly emotional. "He showed up when I was feeling particularly lonely. Travis was working from morning to night. I realized he was doing it for us, but Caden knew how to listen. He understood my dreams of a different life. He manipulated you from the beginning," Ramirez said softly. "It was a worked-out scheme." "It wasn't my idea." Desiree raised tearful eyes. "Caden told me that Travis was dragging me down, that I was worthy of more. Every day, little by little, he convinced me that our marriage was a mistake, that it would be merciful. A quick death instead of years trapped in an unhappy marriage." The detective spread the photographs of the other two victims in front of her. "Look at these women, Eleanor Brighton, Maria Rodriguez. Do you know them?" Desiree went pale. "No. Who are they?" "Your lover's other victims. He used the same scheme after each of them died. Holt received large sums of money. You were next on the list, Desiree. After you would help him kill your husband, he planned to get rid of you too." To prove his words, Ramirez showed her the documents found in Holt's locker. Among them was a life insurance policy for Desiree herself, issued through a front man. She spent the next 2 hours telling her everything in detail. How Caden had gradually led her to the idea of murder. How he'd taught her how to prepare the poison sauce, making her rehearse the moves over and over, getting the dosage perfect. How he'd planned their escape. She realized now that there was no them. At this time, an arrest was taking place at the Olympus Fitness Club. Caden Holt didn't resist. He knew the game was over. In his locker, they found not only forged passports and tickets to Bangkok, but also elaborate plans for new murders, lists of potential victims with notes on their financial status and psychological weaknesses. At the first interrogation, Holt kept a cool head. A criminal psychologist who was present during the interview noted the classic signs of sociopathy: a complete lack of empathy with a perfect understanding of human emotions and the ability to manipulate them. "You have no evidence," Holt smiled. "It's all built on the testimony of an emotionally unstable woman who confessed to killing her husband herself. But the evidence kept piling up. Forensics found traces of poison not only on his belongings, but also in his apartment. Encrypted correspondence with suppliers in Thailand was found in his phone. Bank transfers added up to a clear pattern of systematic murder for profit. The trial began 3 months later and drew national attention. Prosecutor Michael Stone presented the jury with the story of a serial killer who turned his job as a fitness trainer into the perfect cover for finding victims. Witnesses took turns at the bench to testify. Eleanor Brighton's relatives talked about how their sister had changed since meeting Holt. Maria Rodriguez's daughter tearfully recalled her last conversation with her mother. Fitness club clients described how Holt skillfully chose potential victims among wealthy and emotionally vulnerable women. Abigail Swanson presented toxicology results to the court, explaining how the rare poison affected the victims' bodies to mimic a heart attack. Her testimony was a turning point in the trial. Desiree Murfield was the last to speak. She looked haggard in an austere gray suit, but she held her dignity. Her confession and detailed account of Holt's methods of manipulation made a strong impression on the jury. "I'm not apologizing," she said, looking Travis's family in the eye. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want everyone to know that Caden Holt is a monster who turns other people's weaknesses into weapons." Holt kept his cocky smile until the last moment. Even as the jury reached a guilty verdict, he looked like everything was going according to his plan. In his last word, he called himself a death artist and said that society would hear from him again. The sentence was harsh: life in prison without parole for 3 proven murders. Desiree received 15 years with the possibility of parole in 7 years, given her cooperation with the investigation and her role as a victim of manipulation. While in prison, Holt began writing a memoir, offering publishers the story of California's most fascinating killer. Several publishers were interested in the project, but after protests from the victims' families, they declined to publish. Desiree was sent to a medium-security women's prison. There she began attending psychological counseling and group therapy. The prison psychologist noted her sincere remorse and gradual realization of the depth of the manipulation she had been subjected to. Detective Ramirez continued to follow the case even after sentencing. It bothered him that not all the details added up to a coherent picture. Several large financial transfers went unexplained, suggesting Holt's possible accomplices at large. A year after the trial was completed, Abigail Swanson published a scientific paper on methods for detecting rare plant poisons in tissues. Her research led to a review of several natural deaths in other states. 2 cases turned out to be similar to Holt's methods, giving rise to the theory that there was a whole network of killers using similar schemes. The Happy Burger food truck was sold at a charity auction. The proceeds went to a fund to help victims of domestic violence. The new owner kept Travis's original sauce recipe, turning it into a kind of memorial to the tragically deceased chef. Travis's family established a scholarship in his name for culinary school students. Each year, young chefs were given the chance to start their own business, something Travis himself had always dreamed of. Detective Ramirez often returned his thoughts to the case. As he drove past the Olympus Fitness Club, he thought about how many other similar stories lurked behind the mirrored walls of trendy establishments, where loneliness and dreams became tools in the hands of skillful manipulators. It was a new habit in his office to review the natural deaths summaries every morning, looking especially closely at cases of sudden heart attacks in relatively healthy people. He knew that sometimes there was a crime behind a natural death and cold-blooded calculation behind a beautiful love story. 5 years after the trial, journalists tried to interview all the participants in the case. Holt was still in a maximum security prison, continuing to write his memoirs. Desiree, who was granted parole for good behavior, declined to comment and left for a small town in Oregon, where she got a job at a library. Abigail Swanson set up a special lab to research rare poisons and now consulted for police across the country. And in the archives of the San Diego Police Department, the case took its place among the solved crimes, becoming a training material for young detectives. The story of how love can be the most dangerous weapon and a beautiful dream, a death trap, regularly reminded them. Sometimes the scariest monsters wear the most charming masks.